The Watcher and the Wraith, written by Leith. I lose when there is nothing. My teeth sink the speckled drops of copper prey. His own the very darkness from which I lash out. That perverted emptiness, that self-deluded eyes of an oblivion for which mortals ache. Cut by the cloth of darkness, do not succumb, but listen and wait. Honestly, everything is just too accessible. One of the main issues with our culture is everything is so accessible. Sex, media, food. It's not bad that food's accessible, but we don't live in a post-scarcity environment. We live in an accessibility environment. And, it's the same old thing. There's cognitive overload. There's too much information for people to reasonably process, so it kind of ends up with us skimming the pond. Not a new concept. This has kind of been how films have been produced for probably the last, ever since there was huge inter-studio competition. But, maybe doing something complex is the way to experience difficulty again. Maybe complexity is really the only thing we have in information overload, is that to submit ourselves to the complexity, to the lifelong pursuit of very difficult, I don't know if esoteric is the right word, but very distant endeavors. Much the same way as watching a guy, I believe his name was Yang, going between silent meditation retreat and a fitness expo. He was remarking on the paradoxes and the shift in paradox between the two. I think he makes a good point on that. And he's talking about holding multiple paradoxes, which I still think is an interesting way of life. But he does point to the fact that those paradoxes and kind of going down that almost eternal rabbit hole, that hyper-specialization becomes where meaning can be derived from. And so you have such divergent interest. I mean, that's what happens with politics. We exist kind of in a century of divergence. And so the reality is how do we cope with that divergence? Art and culture has always been a way that we have coped with the complexities of the world around us. So what do we do to deal with, this reality where we all live in complex, divergent paradigms? Specialize. I mean, I'd argue that this is a point for automation, and that this is where you kind of want to have solid algorithms in social media to connect people. But how do you do that in a at least pseudo-democratic way, if not meritocratic or pragmatic way? So, that's one of the main questions that has been driving me for quite a while, and it's crystallized. I always knew about kind of the walled garden of the internet and how that was going to play out with the semantic web and how it's kind of really evolved, but the culture's evolved to it where, if you're into an abstract project, someone on the internet is really into it. They're really gone in depth with it. There's someone who's specialized in it. There's a content creator for it. If you want to make flower tiaras, there'll be someone on YouTube who has specialized in the creation of flower tiaras, and there's a huge how-to video. Even my niece, she's obsessed with slime, which may not be too out there, but I mean, imagine a generation of kids who have grown up in a sense of hyper-specialization of interests. It does have the side effect of isolation if there's no real connector within it. And how do you connect tribes in an effective way without undermining rights, thoughts, circumstance? And there's a lot of people who'd be considering that without caring about the ethical implications or the consequences or the social consequences for it. Because, likely they're narcissists, or they're indifferent, or they have some degree of cluster B personality disorder. and I'm not one to diagnose these things, but to say that these things don't play out in society is ridiculous. Any ideology, any perspective can be perverted by bad intention if you don't go about it the right way, and that's anything can be perverted. It's kind of the nature of it. Anything can fall. Any human can fall from the garden. There's no exceptionalism in there unless you're a divine being that just isn't into that kind of thing. Well, then you're fundamentally not human. So, I guess why Watcher and the Wraith? I have no idea. Just a bunch of stuff that came up when I sat back in St. John's and I tried to think of something to write. There's always a negative voice in you. And a lot of times it speaks in riddles that aren't really intelligible. But if you go deep enough, there's usually enough reasons behind all your negativity and all your kind of angry self-talk that if you work yourself through to it, like work yourself right through to the end of it, you'll find that there's a natural cause that you're kind of dealing with, or there's just a psychological cause that you've internalized at some point in your life. And getting to the end of that internalization is kind of the path to liberation, or at least I think in the spiritual traditions of the world. I mean, I hesitate to say spiritual traditions, not because I have anything against them or they're not spiritual. It's more to the fact that it's so much more encompassing. It's more to the fact that it's so all-encompassing that the division doesn't just stop at spiritual practice. It goes right into everything you do within your daily life and how you approach it and how you relate to it. Enlightenment is completely involved. The pursuit of it is completely involved, and it doesn't end at anything in your life. So it's a cremation of universal awareness that you kind of engage in, and whether it's ethereal awareness or not, people who exist within awareness themselves, they're still looking at the same object fundamentally, an existence of complete awareness of your actions and that continuance. But how can one judge if someone is not acting in awareness if the social environment and circumstance can kind of accommodate it? It's much in the past where in ancient Rome you would have a very rich landowner who could have slaves and wine, and the social culture accommodated for that kind of hedonistic departure, and that protection of that hedonistic departure became a basis for social organization because of the power they wield within it. And it's one of the main criticisms of our culture is that it's a bad idea. You don't make good decisions, and fundamentally they end up being self-defeating. But what if you have a circumstance or something in virtual reality where none of those things are damaging? You can argue that there's still a spiritual damage to that kind of indulgence, but if there's no social damage, no social damage. As we kind of push to that direction where everything is automatic, if I may reference. I don't think that everything is skin deep, though. I think that's the difference. It may be automatic in certain ways. There's automatic connectivity, but the depth is constant and growing. I think that's, if we're talking about, again, Matthew Good, yeah, the future's X-rated. The future's got a lot of ratings. The diversity of creation experiment is always consistent. And it's just really the depth of society, the depth of culture, the never-ending depth. Everything seems so superficial because we can't fathom how deep and how connected and how complex everything is. And so our reaction is to view things as superficial. Don't get me wrong, there are superficial interactions, superficial people, at least on the surface. the dog needs to go outside. So this is Laith Newer signing off.